So, got this very good question here from Fizar Sumro. I just thought I'd answer it, and if you guys like this, then maybe I'll do more of these. It does depend on you guys sending me your questions, obviously. But let's begin with this one, get into some biology deep cuts. So Fizar asks, my biology teacher told me that the pumping of protons here, referring to proton pumping during oxidative phosphorylation, actually is a case of active transport, whereas in my video I say that the pumping of protons is not active transport and you should not refer to it as active transport. I'm so confused. So let's start answering this question.
Let's quickly sketch out the mitochondria, outer membrane, and the inner folds, the cristae, inner mitochondrial membrane, and we've got our, on that inner mitochondrial membrane, we've got our electron transport chain. So let's just draw one on this side like that. Got our 1, 2, 3, our electron transport chain, and then we've got our ATP synthase right here.
Okay, and just a quick recap in case you need a bit of a refresher, but remember that via the Krebs cycle, there's a lot of NADH and FADH that are reduced coenzymes have been produced, and the NADH effectively delivers hydrogen to the electron transport chain, whereupon the hydrogen is split into protons and electrons. The electrons move through the electron transport chain, eventually recombining with oxygen, whereas the protons are moved against a concentration gradient, and this is important. The protons are moved against a concentration gradient into the intermembrane space. Okay, so valid question. So if the protons are being pumped or moved against a concentration gradient, we're using the energy of the electrons to do that. And this is similar to the movement of protons in photosynthesis. Similar situation in the light-dependent stage, where the energy of electrons is used to move protons against a concentration gradient. Why is that not active transport? And the answer is this, and it's got kind of two parts. Okay, so I will accept that this is a form of active transport. So your teacher, Fizar, is not incorrect. This is a form of active transport because of two things. First, the protons are moving against the concentration gradient. That's the first thing. So, active transport. Okay, it's active because it's against a concentration gradient. Two, energy in some form is being used in order to do that. Okay, so because it's against a concentration gradient, it cannot be passive. Energy must be being used to move things against a concentration gradient. So because energy is used, again, that satisfies the requirements of being an active transport. And this is where we get into the deep cuts of biology here. Actually, there's different types of active transport. You might want to look this up if you're very interested. It's called primary active transport and secondary active transport. Primary active transport is when you use the energy from ATP. So primary active transport uses energy from ATP in order to move things against the concentration gradient. So it's all about where this energy comes from. So primary active transport uses energy from ATP. Secondary active transport uses the potential energy in pre-existing concentration gradients. So what's the difference? So what's the difference between primary and secondary active transport? Primary active transport is the one that we are most familiar with. Primary active transport, say, got a membrane right there, and you've got sodium here at a low concentration, and you've got sodium there at a high concentration. Well, active transport will move sodium from a low to a high concentration via a protein, but with the hydrolysis of ATP. Okay, so you use an energy source, in this case ATP, to move something against the concentration gradient. That's primary. That's primary active transport. Secondary active transport is when you use the concentration gradient of substance A to move substance B against its concentration gradient. So let's look at another example. Let's say we have got sodium right here. It's at a low concentration, and we've got sodium here at a high concentration. So sodium will passively move from here to here. But what you can do, now let's say you have glucose. Now glucose is at a low concentration here, but at a high concentration on this side. However, we still want to get glucose moving that way. So what you do is evolve a protein that will use the energy of sodium moving down its concentration gradient, because when things move down their concentration gradient, they release a little bit of energy, and you can couple that, and you can then drive the movement of glucose against its concentration gradient by using the energy of sodium moving down its concentration gradient. So this is an example. We're using the passive process here to drive an active process here. Okay, so this is a secondary active transport. Why is it called secondary active transport? Because ATP must have been used to get sodium in this unbalanced situation. So the kind of reading between the lines, ATP must have been used in order to generate the sodium gradient, and then we use the sodium gradient to move glucose against its concentration gradient. So we're not directly using ATP, but we're indirectly using ATP, and therefore we call this kind of transport secondary active transport. I hope you're following me so far. So having described these two forms of active transport, where does the movement of protons during or due to the electron transport chain, where does that fall in to this picture? Well, I would say that it does constitute a primary active transport because it uses a direct source of energy. So let's just elaborate a little bit here, because it's going to get a bit confusing. So we have primary active transport. They use energy directly. So either they're the standard ATP using protein, they hydrolyze the ATP, and they use the energy that's released to move something against the concentration gradient. Or they don't use ATP, but they use another energy source. And what could these other energy sources be? Well, they both involve electrons, but one uses electrons charged up with the energy from light. Okay, so that's in the electron transport chain in the light-dependent stage of photosynthesis. And the other one is using, again, electrons, but it's from the redox reactions from the transfer of electrons between electron carriers. I'm kind of not making a great case for not calling this active transport, but I am going to get to the answer, which is this. We've established that primary active transport mechanisms, they use the energy directly from some source. Why should you not call these active transports? And I've got two reasons here. One is scientific, and the other one is more practical for you if you are sitting exams, in particular A-level exams. Here's the first reason, the scientific reason. The scientific reason is this, that there must be a way to distinguish between these two types of, or these two modes of transport. Because you learn about this, you learn about ATP, and you learn about this. And so there needs to be a way to discriminate between these two, to distinguish them, those types of transport. So the first reason is the scientific one, and it's not unrelated to the second reason, but there needs to be a way to distinguish between active transport using ATP and that which does not. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is highly related to that, which is if you're sitting an exam, you cannot confuse different parts of your content. You cannot be ambiguous about what you're talking about in an exam, because exams are about demonstrating to the examiner that you understand something. Okay, so the second reason is avoiding ambiguity during an exam or some other assessment. Okay, your examiner cannot be under any doubt about whether you understand the difference between this form of transport and this form of transport. Okay, so the second reason is more kind of practical in nature, but it's going to have very significant impact on you potentially. Okay, so one reason, scientific, we need to be able to discriminate the two forms of transport for ourselves and when we're communicating that. And the second, in a more practical sense, you don't want your examiner to think that you're not sure about the difference between active transport and things moving when ATP is not the energy source. Okay, so that's my answer. This is my opinion. Feel free to disagree with it. And if you have any other questions which you'd like me to research and clear up for you, please either email me or leave a comment on the video that it relates to. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening.